a panel or a mixed pair presentation on student athlete health and safety. Jerry is an athletic trainer. I'm an athletic trainer. Our first presenter, Jay Gresh, is also an athletic trainer, and his co-presenter, Christina Carter, actually started life as an athletic trainer at one point. So it's very appropriate. Jake received his bachelor's and master's at South Dakota State University and did his PhD at the University of Georgia. He is an associate professor at the University of Virginia and focuses his research on assessment of concussion. Christina Carter, Dr. Christina Carter, is currently the executive director of the Student Success Center at the University of Tulsa, was formerly the director of athletic academic support at the University of Tulsa. Her bachelor's is from Northeastern State University, and her PhD is from the University of Oklahoma. We're very pleased to have both of them presenting today. Christina and Jake.
Thank you.
Well, we appreciate you all extending the invite to participate in today's session. It's been very educational, learning about gambling. I was actually gambling during the break here. And I ended up losing, so what was expressed, what held true. But Greg
You
was
don't look
kind of,
tired.
what's that?
You don't look tired
It's
or angry.
kind of sad, but with Greg, we appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about student athlete health and safety, but more specifically underneath the guise of concussion. So with the presentation today, we're going to start this with more of a case study point of view, but we want to give you a background because some of you might not be familiar with what a concussion is. So this is a classic definition. This definition has been around for a very long time. A sport-related concussion is a traumatic brain injury induced by a biomechanical force to the head, neck, or body. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about this biomechanical forces in a second. Now, this is a little tease of what's yet to come. In Amsterdam, this last October, there was a meeting, and this meeting was a gathering of experts related to concussion from across the world. And they revisited the definition of concussion. And what I just told you about a concussion being a traumatic brain injury induced by a biomechanical force is a conceptual definition. And to an athletic trainer's optimism, we now have an operational definition. So we actually can say what a concussion is and what it's not when we're making our diagnosis, opposed to be in that gray area. So in order to now have a concussion, you have to have a plausible mechanism, a hit to the head, neck, or body. Along with that mechanism, so if you don't have that mechanism of injury, it's not a concussion. Along with that mechanism, as soon as we know that you've taken a hit to the head, neck, or body, you need to have one clinical sign. So for example, difficulty balancing, we'll see an example of that in a second. Or maybe you appear confused, you run to the wrong huddle, the wrong sideline, etc. A million-mile stare, but you need to have at least one clinical sign and or two or more symptoms. So I have a headache, I'm dizzy, I'm nauseous, along with a clinical exam finding. So maybe neurocognitive deficits or more objective evaluation of balance. The one thing that you'll find that's going to be emphasized is neuroimaging is not useful following a concussion. I'm not saying this in terms of advanced neuroimaging. I'm talking about this in terms of clinical MRIs, clinical CT scans that you would find in the university department. Only 0.4% of MRIs show anything other than an absolutely normal brain. So it's not a structural injury, it's a physiological injury. So the new recommendations are really going to tone down the use of standard routine imaging with a concussion. So what does a concussion look like? Well, I'm going to give you three different cases. So the first one is probably the one that is most commonly known over the last NFL season, and that's with Tua. And this is his second injury within 1 week. And the reason why I'm showing a second injury is that Tua had an injury the previous week, which everyone thought was a concussion. Now, one of the things I've learned as a healthcare professional is I'm not going to be an armchair athletic trainer. I'm not going to be there and say, well, it's definitely a concussion. In the week prior to this, because I wasn't there and Tua was experiencing low back pain. He may have been taking medications that mimic the signs and symptoms of a concussion. Given the discomfort he was in. This injury was deemed a concussion. And you can see the mechanism of injury here in a second. As I said, it's a hit to the head, neck, or body, and his head went directly into the field. Now, this is the NFL. This is a girls' soccer practice. And again, I'm sorry for the video not being as large, but this is a female soccer athlete experiencing the same mechanism of injury where it's the head versus the field, and the field will always win. And there may or may not be an athletic trainer on the sideline for this female soccer game. Why? Because it's a high school. Second thing, it's a female sport. And we know that female sports are woefully underserved at all levels when it comes to medical care. Now, this is the most frightening piece. This is Pee Wee football with volunteer coaches.
Oh,
This poor child was told to get up,
oh,
you'll be fine,
serious.
and go home.
God.
These are volunteer coaches, and if you need to, I'll show this one more time.
Oh,
This is most frightening, and this is the group that has the highest number of concussions because everyone gets to play. But unfortunately, pediatricians and others are woefully uninformed about concussions because they have to do so much other medical care well. And I don't point fingers at pediatricians, emergency department physicians when they are underserving populations about concussion because they have to do everything else, right? And so this is one of the things that hopefully you get out of this meeting today is that you'll learn more about this injury and what we can do about it. So at the University of Virginia, one of the pieces that I mentioned that is in the definition of a concussion is a biomechanical force. That was conceptual. Now we're being a little bit more objective. This is an injury that we had at the University of Virginia. What you don't see is this was a two-hit injury. One was the head to the shoulder pad, and then when the athlete was going to the ground, it was a head to a knee. Now, with this study that we're doing, this athlete was wearing an instrumented mouth guard. This mouth guard looks no different from any other mouth guard. It's roughly $1,200 to equip an athlete with this mouth guard. And from the data from this mouth guard, we can get an idea of linear force. We can get an idea of rotational force. But more importantly, which moves the needle forward here, is that we can recreate the brain of this athlete using a biomechanical model to show you where most of the neuronal strain or the stretching was following a concussive hit. I'll show you this again. The red represents the most stretching of neurons and where they occurred in the brain. Like I said, there were two hits. That's where you see the red followed by kind of a diminished red and then the second pop of red there. So what's happening when those neurons are stretched? So I relate this to the Great Recession and why it's an issue of the supply and demand. So here you have a chart that I think makes us all a little bit nauseous. Prior to Obama's presidency, we're at historic lows for unemployment. What Obama inherited was quite the mess, where unemployment skyrocketed during the Great Recession. And it was at historic highs, roughly around 10.5%. Some would say that's actually 24%. So in essence, we had a huge demand for work, but little supply. Over Obama's presidency, transitioning into 2016, 2017, unemployment went back down to historic unemployment rates. And one of the questions that was raised, if you listen to any radio pundit, was even though it looked like it was recovery, was it truly recovery, or were we still experiencing a recession? Now I'm going to relate that to concussion. So here is a hand-drawn neuron. I credit my doc student with this. I like the look of this. It's pretty cool. So this is a neuron that's been stretched after a concussion. And with this neuron, typically when you think about high school biology, when you think about a muscle when it contracts, or when you think about a neuron when it fires, we have a sodium-potassium pump. It allows potassium to exit the cell, sodium to enter the cell, and then everything goes back to normal after the muscle or the neuron relaxes. Following a concussion, following that concussive hit, we have an amino acid that binds to that neuron that opens the floodgates for calcium and sodium into the cell. Calcium is not allowed in the cell under normal states. This is something that's ionic flux that requires immediate correction. Unfortunately, when this happens, when potassium exits the cell and these ions, calcium and sodium, enter the cell, it requires energy to restore homeostasis, just like any other impulse within the brain. At this time, and people don't appreciate this, the blood flow to this region in the brain is diminished by about 50%. 50
Repeat that, it's diminished, what's diminished by?
blood flow. So if you think about the region of the brain that's affected by this concussive hit, blood flow is reduced by 50%. So what that does is it limits the ability for the neuron to go back to homeostasis. We have an issue with supply and demand. We're demanding energy, but we have a limited supply. It takes 7 to 10 days for this to go back to normal, and that's true for rodent models, which this is based off of, as well as human models, but there's a caveat to that. I'm gonna come back to that.
Did you say 2 days to recover?
7 to 10. 7 to 10. So this is data from the NCAA DoD Care Consortium. This is the largest collegiate study that's ever been performed. And what they demonstrated was that athletes reported symptom-free, the majority of athletes reported symptom-free and returned to sport. So after being cleared by a medical provider within 14 days of a diagnosed injury. This aligns really well with our animal models. This is a multi-site study that I'm leading or co-leading with Dr. Dave Seafood at the Virginia Commonwealth University. And we found the exact same thing. By 7 to 14 days, the majority of athletes return to play. Now, what's important about both of these figures is that it's absolutely normal if an athlete takes up to 30 days to recover from their injury. It's absolutely fine. Let me put that in perspective. If you have a concussion, it may take up to 1 month for someone to report symptom-free. If you tear your ACL, you could be out for 2 years, or your career could be over. We're not asking our athletes for that long to report their symptoms, have them be removed from play so we can facilitate more timely recovery. As I mentioned, there was a caveat to what I showed you for really until the last few years. That diagram of the neuron stretching, it's referred to as a neurometabolic cascade. It was based on animal models. We advanced that a bit more. So in 2015, the Coughlin group out of Johns Hopkins looked at retired NFL athletes and looked at an inflammatory response in the brain of former NFL athletes. And what they found was these athletes had brains that had excessive microglial activation. Microglia are responsible for the immune function of the brain. So the cleanup crew, when there is an insult to the brain, when compared to a healthy group of the same age, there is no mincing of words to say the retired NFL athletes had substantially more inflammation in their brains compared to healthy athletes. We just published a study. We took active collegiate athletes who've been cleared medically to return to play after a concussion. We compared them to healthy students and found that throughout the limbic system, there's a system that's responsible for processing memory and emotion, despite achieving full clinical recovery using a pretty good clinical model. I'll talk about that in a second. The concussed athletes had anywhere from 27 to 137% more inflammation in their brain compared to those that otherwise were healthy. So what does this mean? Is this CTE? Is this? We don't know what this is. We just know it is. And I think that's the biggest takeaway. There's so much we don't know about concussion. This could be due to the sensitivity of the tool that we're using. It could absolutely be a neuroprotective effect, or it could be something that could be neurotoxic. And that's why we're trying to expand this effort now. So this statistic makes me nauseous, and it makes me nauseous for 2 reasons. If you read any concussion article, it usually starts with this sentence. Every article. What makes me more nauseous is this is based on emergency department data. And what makes me sick is this data is misleading. Only 11% of concussions are accurately diagnosed and recorded in emergency departments in the United States. That 3.8 million number is based on the values of recorded concussions. So the question is, do we need to slide that decimal place over by 1? Or can we just simply say there's a lot more concussions occurring that we actually know of? I'll get back. I really like bathroom figures. I think they're really neat. So if you look at the girl bathroom figure up there, there's a reason why I circled the girl opposed to the guy. We'll get to that in a second. So as you can see, sport, if you look at the mechanism of injury, yes, absolutely. Sport's one of the primary reasons why individuals are diagnosed with a concussion. These are data that were published in 2006 and then revisited in 2013. So in other words, for those concussions diagnosed in an emergency department, 30%. are due to sport. Look what else we have here. Motor vehicle accidents, falls, bicycle accidents, assaults, pedestrian accidents, motor vehicle accidents. These aren't sport related. We just don't hear about it. So in essence, the number one cause of concussion is life. I don't think we have a compelling argument to remove athletes from sport when they can easily have a car accident that same afternoon. So next, let's break into our case study. Here we have a 20-year-old previously healthy female volleyball athlete. No history of concussion, no history of psychiatric conditions, no history of any neurological conditions. She suffered a mild traumatic brain injury. Please remember that a concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury. Mechanism of injury, you're going to see that in a second. It's volleyball. And specifically, the patient was hit in the frontal region of the head with a volleyball. And she experienced immediate loss of consciousness. So this is the video. This is a video that I pulled of a volleyball concussion. The reason why I'm talking about volleyball here will be a little bit more apparent once we get a little bit further in the presentation. So here is the video. Notice how he's trying to mobilize the head.
You got hit like right here.
Right in the frontal region of her head. At the University of Virginia, within 2 weeks, a few years ago, we had 10 concussions. Why? Because the coaches thought it was a great idea to try a new drill.
She tried what? A new drill. Oh,
It was a blocking drill,
That trick.
block with your
but it's
head
volleyball. Concussions don't happen in volleyball. They only happen in football, right?
or soccer.
This is a study we published in 2017 that we really wanted to get at the idea of what are the true biological sex differences in terms of concussion. The filled in circles and the open circles represent collegiate female athletes and high school athletes. What I want you to take away from this figure is that every time a female sport has an equal male counterpart, softball, baseball, basketball, soccer, women will always have a higher number of concussions.
Wow.
Always. In fact, let's compare, if I can see my mouse here. If we look at football, American football, and we just come right across to the same level in incidence of concussion, we have women's ice hockey. We don't see women's ice hockey that often on ESPN. We don't hear about it. So what do we do for concussion? So Christina is going to do a great job talking about return to learn considerations of what we can do as faculty for these young men and women who are trying to return to the classroom. And they don't need to be athletes in order to have these same recommendations. So let's start this off by saying, we have a pretty good system at UVA. It is not a perfect system. We're going to take this young volleyball athlete through our system. So after they arrive during the summer, before they set foot on a field or on a court, they have to undergo a baseline test or a pre-injury assessment to get a clinical snapshot of what they're trying to get back to if they do have an injury. So for our protocol, we do a computerized neurocognitive test called IMPACT. We do 2 balance assessments. We do the gold standard balance assessment called the sensory organization test. We're very fortunate to have 3 of these units at UVA. Each of these units is $160,000. No high school can afford that. We also do a sideline measure called a tandem gait. We look at symptoms in 2 different ways. And if you're curious why, we can talk about that later. We also look at visual function and vestibular ocular function using a sideline tool called the VOMS, vestibular ocular motor screen. We also assess, I'll come back to this in a second, anxiety, depression, and fear of movement. And with the TSK, which is the Tampa scale of kinesiophobia. And we also assess sleep. Sleep, as we recently found out, plays a critical role following concussion. Absolutely critical. In fact, did you know athletes that express sleep symptoms after a concussion take twice as long to recover than those athletes that don't? Literally twice as long.
So when you say sleep, I'm sorry.
How do you do the sleep?
Right. So they simply say during the last 24 hours, I had drowsiness. I have trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or sleeping more or less than usual. All they had to do is express that. When we compare the groups, it's between the eyes test, they take twice as long. We also, my doctoral student, who I'll talk about here in a second, just finished her dissertation data that strongly painted a picture that sleep is one of the driving factors of why some athletes recover during a typical time frame versus an atypical time frame. And I'll show you some of that data as well.
So excessive sleep is deleterious as well.
Absolutely. So anytime an athlete drifts over 9 hours of sleep, we start to see neurocognitive deficits.
Does it make a difference whether you passed out from getting hit or not?
No, and in fact, we no longer grade concussions. They used to be grade 1, 2, and 3, and primarily they were based on loss of consciousness, amnesia. But if you look at the 30 different grading scales that once existed for concussion, they were all different. So one scale said loss of consciousness was a mild concussion, where another scale said that was a grade 3. So now we just say you have a concussion or you don't. So I'm going to give a quick plug for my doctoral student who will now be at the University of Colorado this summer. See this QR code up here? So all of our athletes, when they come and sit down, I'm very proud of our system. We have a great group of undergraduate students. I have 2 doc students and myself that work together to do the system. We test no more than 4 athletes at a time. And those 4 athletes are divided into 2 groups, and now they're groups of 2. And they're getting individualized care to make sure we get the best data from each assessment that we do with an athlete. This QR code system was replacing a folder that we had. We killed a lot of trees. And my doc student came from Cirque du Soleil and she's like, do you mind if I try to fix this? And I'm like, go for it. Let's see what you got. And what she did is she created a Qualtrics survey. And what's nice about this survey is that athlete sits down on the wall, there's a QR code, they scan the QR code with their phone, they enter in their data, they click submit, and it goes to a HIPAA compliant database. More importantly, I mentioned the PHQ-9. Let's come back to that. The 9th item on the PHQ-9 is I have thoughts of harming myself or if the world will be better off without me. If an athlete indicates anything higher than a 0 for that particular question, when they click submit, our associate director of sports medicine, our physicians, our sports psychologists, that athlete's athlete trainer, and my research team are all notified via email that moment. The athlete continues doing the rest of the assessment. And when that athlete finishes, they're escorted to a room and they're immediately cared for. That's the power of an emergency action plan for mental health. So.
I like that because one of the things I teach my students, and I often talk about masculinity and trying to assess depression and things like that. People are high on the masculinity scale. And one of the pieces of advice I give them is just basically, it's like, have them do it pen to paper. They're more likely to be honest with you if their masculinity isn't threatened by asking them the questions. So I think you're getting better information from doing that as well.
And this is discreet. I mean, they're looking at their smart device. And in fact, one of the best bartenders you can ever have is the impact. The impact is a computerized neurocognitive test that we do. And because we'll ask an athlete, have you had any symptoms? They'll say no. They'll see my research team. Have you had any symptoms? No. And they'll see impact. They're like, well, I actually had a headache. And so we review that data and we're able to communicate that back to athletic trainers. And then we make sure that athlete gets the care that they deserve. Following an injury, our athletic trainers have QR code keychains. And all they have to do is scan a QR code and it literally takes them through the sideline evaluation. And it actually shows them exactly what to do. So our track and field athletic trainers don't have that many concussions. So they might need to be kind of refreshed. We actually have illustrations of how to do some of these tests right next to the input. And as soon as they click submit from doing a sideline assessment, our entire sports medicine team, from our physicians to the athletic trainer to our associate AD for sports medicine, and every one of our research team members at that moment knows there's a concussion. And then we start providing care. So that being said, we then progress that athlete from that moment of injury back into activities of daily life. And from there, I'm going to turn this over to Christine.
All right, thank you. So, obviously our student athletes are college students and they're in the classroom and you guys see them and it's like, so what happens when they have a concussion? How can we help them as faculty get back to the classroom and what we call return to learn? Before we start that, I wanted to just remind everyone about a couple of best practices and laws and rules. The NCAA Sports Science Institute came out, I think it was 2014, maybe earlier. I know that's the one that's still on the website. That really reiterated that, the medical professionals should have the unchallengeable authority to make medical decisions about student athletes. That means coaches shouldn't be telling students, oh, get up, walk it off, you're fine. Not saying those things still don't happen across the country because occasionally we hear those things, but It's sad that we actually had to have someone put this in writing, right? But, it's in writing. We're there to support our student athletes and their health and safety. Obviously, HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, also, respects and protects the privacy of the student athlete's health information. I will say that when the student athletes arrive for practice each year, they sign numerous forms. I always say, oh, they go sign their life away, but one of them is a HIPAA waiver. And what that allows the athletic training sports medicine staff to communicate with other folks within the athletic department on campus regarding a specific injury, for example, concussion, so that we can then help our student athletes get back to the classroom. So return to learn obviously has to come before return to play. Every school does this a little bit differently, but has a very similar type of model. So most of you, I know there's 3 certified athletic trainers in the room. So you're probably very familiar with this. Every school is required to have some type of concussion management team. At the University of Tulsa, this involves our team physician, our athletic trainer, also includes our academic advisor, might include their faculty, the vestibular therapist, a neurologist. We also include our associate deans, so they're aware of what's going on, our mental health providers, and then student access, which is our accommodations and disability services office. So just to make sure that you're aware of everyone that could possibly be involved. Our academic advisors do work within the athletic department, but they report up through the provost's office, through our student success center. And our student access center also reports up through the provost through our student success center. So again, it's not reporting within the athletic department. Again, they're going to serve as the liaison kind of between the athletic department and academics to help get the student athlete back to the full academic workload. On the very first day of the concussion, obviously a full day of rest is required, regardless, no matter what. So that's not going to change. Obviously, we talked about the unchallengeable authority of the medical professionals, and then individual plans might be developed, just like Jake mentioned, right, about UVA, the things that they do for each of their students.
Is the first day of rest, bed rest or just rest without any activity?
Just rest without any, well, I'm going to defer to the doctor.
Yeah, it's just a matter of if the symptoms for an athlete get worse with a particular activity, we don't want them to do that activity. We don't want to punish them. We don't want them to pontificate about their symptoms in a dark room. We want them to go out. We want them to be active and walk, etc. But it's just dialing it back a little bit. And some athletes actually may not need that full day off, but a good chunk of them do. We want them to get back to their normal life as quickly as possible. And we've learned that probably in the last 10 years, where the more we constrain an athlete cognitively and physically, the worse off their outcomes might be.
But they will most likely not be in class that first day.
Absolutely.
So as far as faculty notification, again, every school does this differently. I know at UVA, they actually have a portal that they send a link to educate faculty about what concussions are. So we're still on the old fashioned email paper chain here, parts of it. But again, the purpose is to educate the faculty and to notify them of what's happened. So our sports medicine staff will send an actual concussion notice to our learning specialist within athletics. Our learning specialist forwards the email with the whole letter, came directly from the sports medicine department, to that student athlete's faculty member, each of their faculty members. They copy the associate dean of their college, they copy the student access office, the FAR, the academic advisor, the athletic trainer from the sport, the compliance officer, and the sport administrator. That way everybody's on the same page. We have a system, early alert system, most of you guys probably do too, where faculty can report concerns of students. Whenever it involves a concussion, we report that as a hardship notification. So one, you have the email that explains it's a concussion, which is allowed because they've signed the HIPAA waiver. On the other hand, if it's a non-student athlete, we have the hardship notification only, but we use the hardship notification for both just to track the information on the alerts. So obviously the concussion notification also includes all NCAA policy, conference policy, recommended minimums regarding any kind you might be able to do in the classroom to help students, which comes actually directly from our student access office. Different signs and symptoms the students might experience. And then, as we resolve the case, which we'll talk about here in a little bit too, the learning specialist then will also go in and close the note in our starfish, our early alert flag. That way they can be tracked how many days they were actually out, for example. Jake mentioned some of these as well, but you can imagine in the classroom, sensitivity to light, headaches, blurred vision, obviously difficulty sleeping, which, as you just mentioned, has lots of side effects, memory problems. So you can imagine it's gonna be really hard in the classroom to continue learning when you're having these issues as you're still recovering for that average 7 to 14 day period. There's a lot of information on this screen, but this again comes as recommendations from our access office. And a lot of it, you know, as well as our sports medicine staff, on things that you can reasonably do as a faculty member. Not asking for any special benefit or extra benefit or anything like that, but recognizing that students are going to need a little bit of extra time because they're recovering from concussion. So, you know, up to maybe 10% of excused absences in class, a couple, 2-3 extra days on assignments and exams. If it's possible, to limit any kind of background noise in the classroom. You know, allow and acknowledge if the student athlete's wearing sunglasses in the classroom, it's a reason. They're not trying to be disrespectful or anything like that. You know, and what's more important is if you notice something, right? If you notice something in the classroom as a faculty member, reporting that, right, to either any of those people that were on the email, the associate dean, the learning specialist, the sports medicine staff. That way we can help the student, you know, bring them back in, continue any kind of monitoring or testing. Another thing that sometimes happens, and it depends on timing of the semester, is obviously our goal is to get the student athlete back to both return to learn and return to play. A lot of times, if it's at the end of the semester, a student might be out for 2 or 3 weeks, they might need to request an incomplete. I know every university has different policies related to this. At the University of Tulsa, the student athlete has to have been passing the class at the time that they request the incomplete from the faculty member. But that would then obviously give them a little bit more time to heal. I'm not saying that happens in every circumstance. It kind of just depends on timing with the semester. Another thing I think is really helpful is if you can provide any kind of notes to students if they're suffering from concussion. And then a couple different things we talk about: inclusive design in the classroom. So delivering information in multiple formats to students as far as their learning styles. So whether it's audio plus the verbal information. The bottom bullet point I always like to bring out, I always, this is something new I always learn, right? If you're using any kind of overhead or PowerPoints, things that are better for any kind of individuals with any kind of issues like this is using a darker background with using darker ink on a white background. It just makes it easier to read for people. Obviously, if there's anything you can do to help provide audio information, any kind of extra charts or tools, hyperlinks instead. Just these are great for everybody, not just student athletes. These are just great recommendations, you know. And I have this in a document as well, if anybody would like that. Some additional resources for both students and student athletes. Sometimes if their symptoms progress beyond the typical 7 to 14 days, you know, they might need an additional individual plan that requires a slower gradual return to coursework in the classroom. They might need to apply for temporary accommodations through our student access office. The concussion itself is not considered an accommodation at our university. It's just considered that hardship notification, but they can apply for accommodations such as a note taker, test accommodations, things like that through our access office. A lot of times they would be referred off campus to a vestibular therapist if they need a little bit more work. And then we just newly, which is really exciting, opened a concussion center at the University of Tulsa through our Oxley College of Health Sciences. And you can see it provides a lot of the same services that the sports medicine departments provide and research centers provide for student athletes. This is both for students and student athletes. So the student athletes still have to start with the sports medicine staff, and they have to receive a referral before they're allowed to go to the concussion center. Luckily, the 2 women that are running the concussion center were both certified athletic trainers by trade, and they recognize this. They're on faculty and academia in the college. But it also Rachel Hildebrand, what'd you say?
Yeah, who is it?
Rachel Hildebrand and Laura, I always forget her last name. I know.
Rachel and Laura.
Rachel and Laura, yes. But again, you know, where we used to refer student athletes off campus for vestibular therapists, now we can, you know, refer them on campus for that rehabilitation if needed. And again, this provides services for non-student athletes as well. So,
That's a good question.
yes.
So, you say your disability office has the ability to provide temporary accommodations. Do you know if that's common across the country?
I don't know for certain.
I'm gonna ask our office because I actually don't know.
So it's a brain injury.
Yeah,
So
so I would think it would be.
academic adjustments should be provided. And I
Yeah.
think one of the things that isn't on Christina's list, which I think is a very comprehensive list, is this idea of anxiety and depression are some of the top predictors for a longer recovery from concussion. If a faculty member were to get news that a student or student athlete had a concussion and simply say, I get it. Take a deep breath, I'm going to help you. You can help facilitate that recovery with modifying exam deadlines and doing whatever activities might provoke symptoms a bit more, but it's going to be so individualized. It's not a one size fits all. But because it is a brain injury, this immediately falls in that category of disability. So it's up to the faculty to understand that there has been a concussion. That's the communication that Christine's outlined is fantastic. But then for the faculty to understand that and say, I accept this and let's reduce that anxiety, because a lot of the anxiety following concussion isn't necessarily due to the brain injury. It absolutely could be. It could be due to how much schoolwork am I going to miss? How many sporting events am I going to miss? I might be kicked off the team. All this anxiety that's undue and can actually lengthen recovery.
I have a question. Is it possible for a student athlete to withdraw from school for a semester because they have a severe injury or, some kind of other thing that's bothering them and then come back?
Yes, they can. Each university has different withdrawal policies, withdrawal deadlines, medical leaves of absences. You can take a missed term. The NCAA rules protects your eligibility for a semester and kind of pauses it. So yes, those are available options as well.
We've got a question online. Mark has a question. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. So you actually hinted at it with your previous question, but about 5 years, so I work in the athletic training side as well from the academic side, but about 5 years ago, I was talking to one of our clinical sites. And that clinical site is actually a pretty high ranking academic school. And they told me, the athletic training staff told me that their biggest headache is actually from the faculty when they would send a request to the faculty about extended deadline, testing in a reduced environment, noise, lights, etc. And so I guess my question is, have you seen some improvement on that from the faculty side? Because I don't think if we went to them and said, hey, this student got in a car wreck and has a concussion, would you make an exception for them? There would be any hesitation, but it seemed like from in talking with them it's like faculty's getting another request from athletics to make a special request for a student athlete. Do you see improvement in that, or do you still find some resistance on that?
We've seen a lot of improvement at Tulsa. And again, I think each school's different. I mean, we're a very small university. I mean, less than 3,000 undergraduate students. So, almost 15% of the student body is student athletes. And that's another reason we copy the associate dean on everything. So and our academic and learning specialist staff, report through the provost's office. So it's coming from an academic office to the faculty. I think that garners a little bit more trust in the process. I think copying the associate dean and getting each school's different, but they have been like our lifeline to really helping faculty understand and educating the faculty about that. So, I think, like I said, each school's different. I think coming from the access office, the student access office reports to the provost, but works very closely with general counsel, with compliance. So anytime it shows anything with an accommodation as far as test accommodations, extra time, note taking, things like that, it's just considered law because it's covered by ADA. So.
And Christina,
Mhm.
to kind of couch where you're coming from on this, if you don't know, the University of Tulsa is a Division I athletic program, obviously, but it's also the smallest university in the country that is like that. Our enrollment is about 3,500, but we're a small D1 program. We're smallest in the world for all I know. So it may be easier for us
Right.
to get things around. We can be pretty nimble when we have to, but at other times, not so much.
And I actually was gonna say, we do the exact same thing in terms of that question because of, if we have any pushback, and that's one of the reasons why we developed the module that Christina referred to because of a physics professor. We copy the chair and then we start going up the chain and really make sure that we bring in the folks that have that power to enforce those adjustments, because unfortunately, for some individuals, concussions are like the tooth fairy, they don't exist. Right, and that's old science, right? That's not even science, to be honest. So I think that point's well taken, especially to think about what's a hierarchy needed to make this enforceable for students and student athletes alike. And the only other thing I was going to add to that is we actually merged the way our students or student athletes are taken care of, so that everyone gets the same letter. So now there's no difference. Right, so students and student athletes receive the same notification to avoid any confusion or that indication of special treatment.
And I will say that through that starfish alert and the hardship notification, and then the top 10 inclusive, and then the recommendations, our faculty get the same letter for students also, not just student athletes. The only caveat difference is us specifically emailing the faculty and copying all those folks. Those other folks are not all in the system, so that's why there's that separate email.
So I think with those, you were starting to address this, but with the new concussion center, then I know it says that student athletes can go through it. Are you requiring all student athletes who have concussions then to go through that concussion
No,
center?
it's on referral only from the sports medicine department and the team physicians, because we want to make sure that they are going back and comparing to like their baseline testing and all the things that they've done through the athletics department and their team physicians first, because I don't want to say we want them to skirt the system, but if a student athlete just goes directly there and they don't have any of the information, then that's not going to help provide the best healthcare recovery for
But
them.
anybody, if they go through that process in athletics, and they're deemed to have a concussion, do they all then have to go through the concussion center?
They don't have to, but it's on referral if needed.
That was just to Mark's question. I was just wondering if you see a difference when you go through, kind of as you said, Jake, right? Everybody gets the same letter, that it eliminates, it strips out the potential subjective biases that some might have against athletics, because everybody has the same process, so there's not.
Or against students because they're not athletes, right? Because non-athletes can't have concussions for some reason. I don't get that. Even though motor vehicle accidents are the #1 cause of concussion.
And the center just opened, it's brand new, so I anticipate that we'll probably be monitoring how that goes, this semester, and then maybe, it's not my area to speak of, but I assume that they'll continue to assess the effectiveness of that program. Is there another question? Eugene?
Eugene has a
Yes.
question.
Yeah, so I'm a little annoyed that you're automatically saying that the faculty are pushing back. When it sounds to me like, as happens it happens whenever the Disability Resource Center is closed, which means my evening classes in the fall, I'm suddenly responsible for finding a reduced distraction room. I can't be in 2 places at once, right? And so I think probably most of the time you get pushback from faculty is because they don't have the ability to deliver, not without inconveniencing themselves, right? They have to sit somewhere else in a quiet room for another hour and 15 minutes while the student takes an exam, unless there's some central support that provides such a place.
I think it just depends on each university. Ours isn't that way. We have a system to help for any kind of nighttime classes to offer different things like that. I will say, I'll be honest, I know that there are sometimes concerns from faculty, which is why I'm, gracious to come here and talk to you about how you can help. But 99% of our faculty are so supportive of the student athletes and our students. We don't run into very many issues at all, if any.
I think the idea of having to find that separate room, it's very specific to the student. And also keep in mind that these are transient. This might be the first 72 hours after an injury, where these adjustments might need to be made. So maybe it's a class, maybe it's 2 classes at most, maybe it's a class in a lab. But the reduced distraction environment doesn't necessarily need to be a separate room in its entirety. It might be, can you dim the lights in the classroom? Is that a possibility? And being a little bit more creative about the content delivery if possible. And if not, let's say that you need full volume for a video, or you need full lighting for a demonstration, maybe that individual doesn't come to class and you're able to record lecture so they can watch the lecture in a reduced environment via Zoom and whatnot. I think COVID taught us a lot of neat things that we can do with a asynchronous environment or even a synchronous environment, just so the student can have that class in a different area. So I think
I
it's
think,
very student dependent.
yeah, but again, that's, you know, you have a class of 250 students or 100 students, right? You then have other people who need different requirements, and there's no, I mean, that still leaves it up to the individual to set the room. Not everyone has a room with good recording, right? Not all classrooms have good recording systems. I'm just saying that, you know, when you get what you are thinking pushback, I think your first question should be, do you think the student's not worthy of this, that it doesn't rise to this occasion, or are you just unable to provide this without great inconvenience and work on your own part?
So from my personal experience, Eugene, it's been faculty not, they've had concussions themselves and they rely on their own medical knowledge to discount what the child's going through. And I think that's what the barrier is. It's not that the faculty can't make the adjustment. I rarely hear that. I hear, I've had multiple concussions, I've been fine, or I didn't have what you've been experiencing. And that's where the pushback that I hear is. It's not necessarily we can't do the adjustments, because yeah, I think the adjustments are subtle. Not every student or student athlete needs a separate room. And in fact, so I teach right now a course of 150 and I teach a course of 20. And I've had 2 concussions this semester, and those adjustments were really easy to make. It was something where the student said, do you mind if I get notes from a friend? Sure. And then they came to the next class and they were able to do well. So I think it's really student dependent. I think the pushback that at least I'm going to refer to, and Christina can give your experiences, again, the faculty's perspective about concussion, and that's why we need to do a better job of educating our peers or faculty about what a concussion is and what it's not, and just the subtle adjustments that can be made in order to create a more conducive environment so that students' anxiety doesn't go up too much because they can't keep up with the coursework. And with a reduced environment, maybe even earplugs could help muffle the sound in order to avoid distractions. But happy to talk about this offline too. But I think a lot of the pushback that I experience and what I hear is the faculty are being more dependent on their own personal experiences with concussion, opposed to even trying to make the academic adjustments.
Thank you.
So it used to be that students had to be screen-free for the first 24 to 48 hours, no more screen-free stuff.
It's dependent. So if they have photophobia, then we would try to reduce screens. During COVID, we had an athlete with a concussion, and we found out actually Zoom was the way to go to watch recorded lectures, because that athlete was able to take bite-sized pieces of the lecture, and then she'd start to feel really tired. She would break, continue the lecture later, and she said that was the best way for her to stay up with classes. And that was for a 10-day period. So again, not forever, but for those two or three classes she was taking, that was really helpful. So if they have photophobia, let's get them off screens, but it won't be for that long.
So I hear a couple things that we could possibly do to help the relationship with student athletes and athletics. One mentioned before, but the stigma of athletes, first of all, dumb jocks, and then getting all the resources, and then they're always demanding something, right? They're always demanding at Hawaii, they're always getting time off to travel. Well, that travel's hard on them. But then, so maybe educating our faculty about, not that we can educate about concussions, but that they are serious and that there is a way to give a lot of accommodations, but also encouraging the university to have resources. So Eugene, if you have a class of 300 and you have an exam and this student athlete needs extra time or something, is there a way the university can help? Because, I could see that it would be fair to ask for assistance if, there are folks with accommodation too.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, I think as noted, seems to be, unique to different universities in terms of the amount of resources that are dedicated to students with different needs. And over time, as I mentioned earlier, we have a Center for Students with Disabilities, and CSD has expanded its capacity significantly over the last 20 years. And we are actually open late into the night now to accommodate these sorts of requests for when professors can't just be on call to deliver quizzes or exams. So, this is something that happened at our university because the need was identified and the resources expanded. So that may be the need there, Eugene, and Louisville. It seems like I'm sure it could be done. It's done other places.
The other thing you could do is review your university's policies for return to learn after a student has had a concussion. I know in the past we discussed that in the athletics committee. And I think some of those members were familiar with it because they're more connected to athletics. The vast majority of our faculty have no clue. And I like the idea of a portal. I'm sick of being barraged by emails.
And, that's something I'm happy to share a link to. The last part of it's identifying UVA's resources. So you would just use that portal for everything else except that last slide. And our education team actually did a really nice job of making it interactive. So it's not just watch a video, it's actually kind of fun. So can I continue with the presentation? Sorry.
Oh, it's not done?
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, my
No, this is
goodness.
good.
There is one more question. Eva says, I wonder if providing faculty with the range of options and ways that can help modify the environment and makeup work options would also be helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Good comment, Eva. All right, so as an athlete, as this young volleyball athlete's recovering from her concussion, she checks in with her athletic trainer every day. Our students actually have a QR code card they take home with them from our student health center. They scan it each and every day. They complete a symptom inventory while their athletic trainer is watching them to see if they're having difficulty completing the inventory, or simply to say, are symptoms getting better, are they getting worse, etc. Once that athlete reports symptom-free, they return to our clinic and they do the full battery of tests that we do at our baseline assessment. This is all one-on-one because we want to provide the best environment for the athlete to take their assessments. After the athlete's symptom-free and they're within normal limits compared to their pre-injury assessment, they continue on with the return to activity protocol where it's progressive exercise to finally a clearance to sport occurs. Keep in mind that this is not a one-day process. This is an additional 4 to 5 day process that an athlete will go through in order to gain that full medical clearance. And if the athlete does become symptomatic again, what we do is we pause for 24 to 48 hours and we reassess them again after that. One of the pieces that we were alluding to a little bit earlier was in this phase, we used to say it's strict cognitive rest, it's strict physical rest. We actually know that's harmful now. We want athletes to go back to their activities of daily living as quickly as possible. In fact, I would encourage students, if they have the option to ride a bus or to walk to class, because exercise is medicine following a concussion. So after the athlete returns to activity, 6 months after they return to sport, we get a brand new assessment on them. Why? Because we want to get a better picture of their performance on that test. And we also want to make sure we capture anything that might be emerging that we didn't catch before. So this has been embedded in UVA athletics since 2014. And every year we meet with our sports medicine staff. We talk about what we do right, what we're not doing as well. We talk about what we should add or take away, and ultimately to ensure the best care possible for our athletes. During this last year, we moved into a new student health and wellbeing center. And one of the issues that we saw is the University of Virginia has 500 concussions a year diagnosed in students. 26,000 students, 500 per year. That's actually about the same rate that we see in athletics. With that being said, Dr. Chris Holstage and I got together and said, can we put our students on the same protocol our athletes are going through and turn that also into a research project? The answer was yes. What I'm most proud of is this. As an athletic trainer, I constantly have in mind the athletic trainers that don't have the resources that we have at UVA. I come from a very rural area in South Dakota and Iowa, where I covered 9 high schools and I was the only doctor they had as an athletic trainer. And so one of the issues that we face with concussion is not everyone has access to an athletic trainer or can afford the same resources as the University of Virginia has in order to care for their athletes. So starting this past spring, we opened up a free concussion clinic to the entire area of Charlottesville and Albemarle County, where these young middle school and high school athletes get free baseline testing, the exact same care collegiate athletes get, hosted by 5 certified athletic trainers and 5 nurses, as well as my students. And we're able to provide that service. Why? Because they deserve it. They're athletes and they need to have the appropriate care in the event of a concussion. Being a researcher and also being somewhat of a politician about this, I had to get a lot of different people on the same page, and it worked. And it's totally worth it, because every time an athlete sees and they click submit, all their HIPAA compliant data goes into a cloud. And so we can learn more about concussion along the spectrum of injury. That's Charlottesville. In 2020, because of the pandemic, I got a phone call from Dave Sifu. And within 10 minutes, we started this idea of, can we develop a consortium together? So I'm proud to be the co-PI of this 22 site consortium, where what we're doing is we're taking UVA's protocol and we're embedding in universities across the US. And I think what's really cool about this is we're learning how to make each sports medicine program better. And it's so neat to hear the conversations that happen between our sites and their athletics departments to say, what are you guys doing well? But there seem to be some gaps here. What can we do to make this better? And this includes the QR code system. So we are looking at this from a variety of different ways, but the basis, the skeleton for this is the SLAM model, the Sports Laboratory Assessment Model that we've had at the University of Virginia. And the goal is this. Every year, there are several new assessments made available for concussion. And believe it or not, I don't know if you heard, we have a brand new blood test for concussion. That same blood test was also the brand new blood test in 2015, 2016, where the FDA approved a blood test. It doesn't evaluate concussion. It determines the need for a CT scan. If there's a risk of a bleed, you have this blood test, and the idea is to reduce the radiation someone might have to undergo if there's a potential bleed. It does not evaluate concussion. We do not have a blood test for concussion. However, we have a variety of different computerized neurocognitive measures that come out yearly. We have all these new imaging techniques, which we still don't know really anything about. We have a variety of fluid biomarkers that are continually touted as the next best thing. At UVA, we actually developed a smartphone app to detect a concussion when the concussion is present, even though an athlete doesn't say a thing. It's just their normal behavior on their phone that we're watching. And then lastly, my doc student, Kat Donahue, again, will be joining Colorado. I credited her with her QR code system, but also she equipped her athletes with the Aura Ring, which is able to look at REM and non-REM while athletes sleep. And she's going to be telling a very convincing story about how sleep is one of the biggest issues with concussion, probably in the next 6 months or so. We want to say, what is the best way? What is the most time and cost-effective way to evaluate and manage concussion? We don't want every site to do this. I think that's impossible. I'd rather say, well, actually, it's just a sheet of paper that you need. Or maybe let's invest in this one ring. Or maybe it's a $1.99 app that you can download it on your phone. That's all you need. And that's the goal. And with that being said, it's really to expand this to the Charlottesville community, as well as through young children, the college athlete who eventually will go on to retire to something else, in order to investigate them with the longitudinal study to see what happens to these athletes with and without concussions as they approach the line for normal cognitive aging. Normal cognitive aging used to begin at age 45. It's now at age 30.
Well, he's gonna get a concussion walking with his phone across the street.
Well, he's not paying attention either at all. So that's good.
Some help.
So I apologize for going over here, and Christina and I are happy to take questions at this time.
I have a question. So did you reach out to community sports groups about what you now have available? for
Yeah,
them?
so we had Osaka and the state
Yeah.
of Virginia. We also have BABA, and they really have nothing when it comes to sideline care. So they're absolutely coming in, but it's still reliant on the child or the parent and the coach to say, go back to the clinic for your follow-up assessment, right? The baseline is only as good as the comparator, right, when it's used.
The big impacts, I wonder, if over time you could look at like the whatever this, kind of test scores the state does for K through 12 and see if there's any impact on that.
And that's one of the things we can do with the university student athletes and athletes as well, is start looking at academic success throughout recovery from a concussion, but overall, and see if there's a dividing point there. In case you're wondering, alcohol is the #1 factor associated with concussions for students at the University of Virginia and Greek life in general,
Non-athletes.
non-athletes,
Oh,
non-athletes.
Yeah, I was actually gonna mention that. I read an article a few years ago, doctor from Boston talking about how when we calculate the costs of alcoholism, we often, or just alcohol consumption, actually, we often leave out people falling down and injuring themselves when they're drunk.
So then we attribute it to a hangover the next day when we don't feel well.
Yeah. So I was intrigued by this mouthpiece that you alluded to earlier. Are those on all the football players at UVA?
So it's funny, we equipped 32 of our A-string athletes or top athletes with these mouth guards, and only 2 of them had concussions over a 2-year period.
Okay.
And so we stopped wearing them for 2 reasons. One, we thought there was promise in this mouth guard as an accelerometer to record the magnitude of injury. What I now more believe than ever is we can't measure the motion of the brain and the skull with a wearable device. There are helmet-based factors, there are patch-based factors, there are mouth guard factors, and the mouth guard is really cool because it's affixed to the skull. There's no other, like the skin, if you put a patch on your skin, the skin moves. If you put a patch in a helmet or a hit system in a helmet, you're measuring the impact of the helmet. We felt if we affix it to the maxilla is directly connected to the skull, that would give us a better idea of the magnitude of impact. What we found was it wasn't the 130 G hit. It wasn't the 24 G hit, which, to give you an idea, a roll in a fighter jet is 9 Gs. Extreme hits in the NFL can be up to 130 to 160 Gs. Okay. So in one case, you're wearing a fighter jet. In another, you're wearing a thin candy shell, which is a helmet. So these mouth guards, they were recording concussions at 42 Gs. So that brought to light this idea of, if we're going to use accelerometer and understand what's actually a threshold for injury, everybody needs to wear the exact same accelerometer. And by the way, for the patches on the skin, they fall off, right? So, and in fact, we had these, this isn't funny. It's funny now. It wasn't really funny at the time. I promise it wasn't funny at the time. We were playing North Carolina State, and one of our athletes threw away their mouth guard. And so we basically asked the developer, can you put a blue chip finder in the mouth guard so we can walk around and find us? We're able to recover the mouth guard, and they're gonna do anything with it anyway. It's all zeros and ones unless you have the proprietary software. But this is a $1,200 mouth guard, and the NFL is using them now because of the data we collected. And I just don't think it's useful. I think we need to think differently. What we did learn, and this is something that I'm excited about. I get excited about a lot of things, so I apologize. One of my colleagues, Dr. Mike Higgins, was talking about accelerometry and how there's really no threshold. But it got me thinking, like, well, what happens if we know there's a threshold? Bad stuff happens. So we know there's a threshold above 50 Gs where catastrophic injuries and concussions are more likely to occur. There's a chance they might occur. So what happens if we were able to warn an athlete of an impending impact above 50 Gs? So what we did, and this was thanks to my childhood playing Madden football, is we were able to create a system where an athlete wears a haptic feedback device on their chest and a mouth guard, and something that's about the size of your thumbnail, and they can wear it anywhere on their body. We can track athletes on the field. In fact, this is called Zephyr. And I'm sorry, Zebra. This is the same technology that fantasy football loves because they can see those little lines on the field. We can track the velocity of athletes with that exact same technology and create a circle around the athlete that you can't see that will expand or shrink depending on how fast the athlete coming at would be victim of a hit would be blindsided. And so as soon as that athlete crosses that halo, we call it the hit alert optic sensor, the vibration on the chest goes off and the athletes to clinch up to mitigate the forces of a concussion. And that was just because someone said the right thing at the right time. And we have really smart people at UVA that I called immediately. I'm like, here's my computer science person. Here's my biomedical engineer. Can we do this? And then we did it.
can they really in the midst of a game time?
300,
Punch it, you get that vibration and
How
stop what
fast
they're
does the
doing.
brain think?
350,
momentum.
you need 350 milliseconds.
For
That's
the
it,
brain to think.
and to react.
What's the cost of
The down-
that
that's a-
device?
So
That's a great idea, but the downside of that is it does nothing for the kid that got hit in the head with a volleyball.
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
so now you can put the chip in the ball. Right? So the chip, the cost of the system, it was $7,000 to equip an entire field. And this is before, of course, marketing gets a hold of this. It was $1.25 for the chip.
Wow.
$1.25 that you can put in a shoe, in a shorts, wear in a headband. And all you're doing in this software and this hardware has been around to track maintenance vehicles on construction sites. And we just reverse engineered it. I didn't. Smart people did. So it was something that the idea isn't to put it on college athletes and pro athletes at this time, rather children. Why? Because children need to develop the motor pattern and know what to do when they get that vibration. And as they grow up with the technology, they'll be able to know, and this is several different lines of research, what is the perfect position to take before getting hit? All we're trying to do is dampen the force that's about to be applied to the individual before they're hit in order to mitigate a potential catastrophic injury or one that could lead to a concussion. I can't say it will prevent a concussion, but we're trying to say for those paraplegic injuries, so it's quadriplegic injuries, the more significant brain injuries, the moderate severe brain injuries. Maybe we can mitigate those forces, and that's huge. That's a win.
But I mean, on the field, couldn't the coaches train people not to like, and they're supposed to be doing that, like to just grab their legs to tackle them instead of hitting them up high? or
So
something?
there's an economics article. You're in economics? History. Where's my economist? Right here. So there's an economics article that was published a few years ago, and they looked at the crown of the helmet rule in the NFL. And the idea was we want to reduce head and spine injuries in the NFL. So basically they said no more hitting head to head. We can't initiate contact with the crown of the helmet. They succeeded. They dropped head and spine injuries by 34%. Lower extremity injuries went up by 34%. Like literally, like it's between the eyes. And the same thing's been demonstrated with the NCAA with rule changes. When you teach an athlete that's already having a motor pattern or pattern established, a new way to do things, they don't do it well. So we gotta start young.
Biomechanically, they,
Absolutely. It takes a while to develop that.
But is it better to have a broken leg or her brain? You know what I mean?
I would say, so Ron Gronkowski would say, I would take
I
a
know.
concussion over a torn ACL. The more I learn about ACL injury, I would rather have a true 45-year-old knee opposed to a 65-year-old knee at the age of 45. And especially if I know that I have a concussion, I know the symptoms of concussion, I immediately remove myself from play because I don't feel well. I tell my sports medicine staff, our typical recovery at UVA for men and women, 6 days. 6 days until they're symptom free. That's so quick. And we double check the data. Our athletes have great outcomes. We have published on this. Between athletes with 0, 1, 2, 3 or more concussions, there's no difference in neurocognitive performance, depression, anxiety, balance with the gold standard. And I think it has to do with the special sauce being athletic trainers. We have 23 athletic trainers. Men and women's sports all have equal coverage, and they have someone to report the injury to and get quality care. So I think that when you ask that question, it's a loaded question because I think, well, our typical recovery is great. Our outcomes are right now really good. We don't know, like, yes, there is an association between CTE and concussion, but there's so much other stuff that's also associated with those same tau protein deposits. Like case in point, I promise I'm going to stop. You got me all wound up here. I'm sorry. Opiate abuse, alcohol abuse, ergogenic aids, glucosteroids, massive weight gain, massive weight loss, type 2 diabetes, repetitive surgery are all associated with the same tau protein deposits that are associated with CTE. NFL athletes have repetitive surgeries, go through massive weight loss, weight gain, have money to spend on lifestyle factors that are conducive to these poor outcomes. And maybe it is the NFL. I don't know. But at the same time, there's so many other lifestyle factors that we don't understand between graduating from college and make it to the pros and retirement from the pros that I don't think anyone ethically can say this causes this. We can't say that yet. Instead, we try to improve the care of the athletes when they have a concussion.
Thank you.
Also, a quick clarification, I thought it was very powerful. You said that 0, does you say 1 to 3 people who have concussions, 1 to 3, who've been treated and followed your protocol have shown no long-term effects. Is that what I heard?
So I didn't catch the first part.
Yeah, that you said that students who have 1 to 3 concussions, but they followed the.
Oh, got it.
effects.
So we published this article. So Dan Rosenblum is one of my doc students right now, and he looked at individuals with a history of 0 concussions, 1 concussion, 2 concussions, or 3 or more concussions. And using symptoms, the gold standard for balance, neurocognitive function, anxiety, depression, no differences. In fact, the people that are most symptomatic were the people without a history of concussion. And this was their first time being assessed by our team. So there wasn't like a bias towards good underreport. We actually pulled their baseline data. And so we feel pretty good about that. And we show this time and time again. We actually did, this is under review right now. We did the first ever deception study with concussion. So we, with our student athletes, we knew who had and did not have a history of concussion. We sent a survey out to them in response to the year of 2020. Some bad stuff happened in 2020. Our student athletes were not immune to it. And we did 2 things. One, we asked them about anxiety and depression, but first we asked about life stressors that everybody experienced during that time. Between groups, those that did not have a history of concussion, remember, we're not asking them about concussion. We're just saying, how's anxiety, how's depression? For those that did and did not have a history of concussion, there's no difference in the life stressors. That chart by itself is powerful to see what our student athletes went through during that period of time. We also had some open-ended responses that just, you pause when you read them and you're saddened by what our athletes went through. When we looked at anxiety and depression, athletes with a history of concussion, nothing. Athletes without a history of concussion, extremely high levels of anxiety and depression. Clinically diagnosable, but not the athletes with a history of concussion. We didn't ask about concussion though. The question is, well, did you follow up and do a second survey? We can't replicate, I don't want to replicate 2020, right? But we can't, that was like a perfect storm of, if we're going to do this and see what the true implications of concussions are, maybe it's an impaired stress response or an issue of depression. We didn't find that. They're very minimal. And this is probably one of the more exciting things.
Do you have any hypothesis on why you found this?
One of the thoughts I heard are athletes, because they may have had a concussion, might have been a little more resilient because they had experience with an injury. So therefore they know they've had experience of anxiety and depression, they know how to handle it a little bit better, but that's about it. But the big takeaway was without a history of concussion, anxiety and depression was far and away more elevated in athletes than those athletes with a history of concussion.
Thank you. This was excellent, excellent talk. I'm excited to continue this positive